it all behind you. I said, take down everything that stands in your way. Don't stop believing it'll work out again, my friend. Stand out and be a part of everything good. Wake up, you're gonna be all that you should. Try out all the things you always wanted to be. You'll see, 'cause I know what I know, that you've got it in you, and I see that you are a winner.
Well, somebody sent me something for my birthday, which happens later this month. Guess what I got for myself for my birthday? Yes, I had to tap into my retirement, but I feel like it's really, really important. Sight is really important, and it will help me to keep a job, if I find a job, to be able to see. So I felt it was worth it, so I took out of my retirement, and I am getting new lenses for these glasses that will be bifocals, so I can finally see. So anyway, what somebody sent me in the mail for my birthday, some very nice person that I appreciate a great deal, is a book that I have wanted for a while. Nailed 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All by David Fitzgerald. Isn't that sweet? Now, what would you say if I tried reading these to you? I'm thinking I might do some videos and just read them to you. Not exactly sure how much I can read, because these look like they could be long chapters, but we will try. We will delve into this book together, and we'll see what we can do. And so I am going to read to you myth number 1 first, and we'll go from there. Number 1 from the book Nailed, 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All by David Fitzgerald. Now, you know I suck at pronouncing big words, so it's not going to be a flawless read, but I will endeavor to do my best. So myth number 1, the idea that Jesus was a myth is ridiculous. Yeah, that's the first myth. In matters of religion, it is very easy to deceive a man and very hard to undeceive him. Quote by Pierre Bayle, or B-A-Y-L-E. Didn't there have to have been a Jesus? Most people have never heard of the ancient Greek mythographer Euhemerus. Euhemerus, who first theorized that the gods of mythology were deified human beings, and their myths, based on legend, sprung from accounts of real people and events. So many might be surprised to find that they are Euhemerus on the subject of Jesus. That is to say, though they may not believe Jesus was the divine Christ that Christianity venerates as the Son of God and Savior of the world, and may regard accounts of the miracles and wonders attending him as mere legendary accretion, E-C-C-R-E-T-I-O-N, nevertheless, they certainly believe there had to have been a central figure that began Christianity. Perhaps he was just a wandering teacher or an exorcist, an apocalyptic prophet or a zealot who opposed the Romans. Perhaps he was all these things, or even a composite of several such early first-century figures. But at any rate, surely there had to be somebody turn the page, at original core, wait a minute, at the original core of Christianity, arguably the most famous individual in human history. All this seems to be perfectly reasonable, completely natural assumption to make. So why would anyone be so foolish as to propose that Jesus never existed? Doesn't it just make more sense to assume that there was a historical Jesus, even if we are unable to recover the real facts about his life and death? As it turns out, no. The opposite is true. The closer we look at the evidence for Jesus, the less solid evidence we find. And the more we find suspicious silences and curious resemblances to the pagan and Jewish religious ideas and philosophies that preceded Christianity. And once you begin to parse out the origins of this tradition or that teaching from their various sources, the sweater begins unraveling quickly until it becomes very difficult to buy that there ever was or even could have been any historical figure at the center. 10 beautiful lies about Jesus. Christianity, like all religious movements, was born from myth-making. And nowhere is this clearer than when we examine the context from which Jesus sprang. The supposed historical underpinnings of Jesus, which apologists insist differentiates their Christ from the myriad of other savior gods and divine sons of the ancient pagan world, simply does not hold up to investigation. On the contrary, the closer we examine the official story, or rather stories, it becomes apparent that the figure of the historical Jesus has traveled with a bodyguard of widely accepted, solemn, examined untruths for over 2 millennia. The purpose of this all too brief examination is to shed light on 10 of these beloved Christian myths. 10 beautiful lies about Jesus. You want to hear all 10 of them? Okay, the first one. The idea that Jesus was a myth is ridiculous. The second one. Jesus was wildly famous, but there was no reason for contemporary historians to notice him. The third one. Ancient historian Josephus wrote about Jesus. The fourth, eyewitnesses wrote the Gospels. The fifth, the Gospels give a consistent picture of Jesus. The sixth, history confirms the Gospels. Seventh, archaeology confirms the Gospels. 8, Paul and the epistles corroborate the Gospels. 9, Christianity began with Jesus and his apostles. And 10, Christianity was a totally new and different, miraculous overnight success that changed the world. Oh, I guess that was too much for that little thing. Okay, it fell on the floor. I also want to give a thumbnail sketch of how the evidence gathered from historians all across the theological spectrum not only debunks these long-cherished myths, but points to a Jesus Christ created solely through the alchemy of hope and imagination, a Messiah transformed from a purely literary theological construct into the familiar figure, or more truthfully, figures, of Jesus, in short, a mythic Christ. And finally, I want to briefly discuss how very different things would be if there had been a historical Jesus. Who says there's no Jesus? We've already begun. Our first Christian myth is the knee-jerk dismissal of the idea that Jesus may have only been a figure of legend. Unsurprisingly, apologists take umbrage at the very notion and declare that historians have always overwhelmingly agreed that Jesus was real. Campus Crusade for Christ minister Josh McDowell gives prime examples of these sorts of dismissive pronouncements in his book, The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict, I think it's page 120. And he quotes, "No serious scholar has ventured to postulate the non-historicity of Jesus." Otto Bentz, What Do We Know About Jesus? That's in parentheses. Then he writes, "Some writers may toy with the fancy of a Christ myth, but they do not do so on the ground of historical evidence. The historicity of Christ is an axiomatic for the unbiased historian as the historicity of Julius Caesar. It is not historians who propagate the Christ myth theories. That's F.F. Bruce. The New Testament documents, are they reliable? It's true enough that the majority of biblical historians do not question the historicity of Jesus, but then again, the majority of biblical historians have always been Christian preachers, so what else could we expect them to say? For all their bluster, the truth is that for as long as there have been Christian writings, there have been critics who have disputed Christian claims and called events from the gospel stories into question. And since at least the 18th century, a growing number of historians have raised serious problems that cast Jesus' historicity into outright doubt, as we'll see. Jesus versus Julius Caesar. For instance, historian Richard Carrier has pointed out the problems with Christian apologist Douglas Geivett, G-E-I-V-E-T-T, claim that the evidence for Jesus' resurrection meets the highest standards of historical inquiry and is as certain as Julius Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BCE. Carrier notes, well, it is common in Christian apologists throughout history to make absurdly exaggerated claims, and this is no exception. Then he compares the evidence for both events. First of all, we have Caesar's own account. In contrast, we have nothing written by Jesus, and we do not know who really wrote any of the Gospels. Second, many of Caesar's enemies reported the crossing of the Rubicon, but we have no hostile or even neutral records of the resurrection until over 100 years after the supposed event, 50 years after Christian beliefs had become widely known. Third, there are numerous inscriptions, coins, mentions of battles, conscriptions, and judgments, which form an almost continuous chain of evidence for Caesar's entire march. But there is no physical evidence of any kind in the case of Jesus. Fourth, almost every historian of the period reports the Rubicon crossing, including the most prominent of the Roman age, Suetonius, Appian, Cassius Dio, and Plutarch. Moreover, these scholars have shown proven reliability, since a great many of their reports on other matters have been confirmed with material evidence and other sources. In addition, they all quote and name many different sources, showing a wide reading of the witnesses and documents, and they consistently show a desire to critically examine claims for which there is any dispute. If that wasn't enough, all of them cite or quote sources written by witnesses, hostile and friendly, of the Rubicon crossing and its repercussions. But not a single historian mentions the resurrection until the 3rd and 4th centuries, and then only Christian historians. Of the anonymous gospel writers, only Luke even claims to be writing history. But neither Luke nor any of the others ever cite any other sources or show signs of a skilled or critical examination of conflicting claims. None have any other literature or scholarship to their credit that we can test for their skill and accuracy. Their actual identities are completely unknown, and all overtly declare their bias toward persuading new converts. Finally, the Roman Civil War could not have proceeded as it did if Caesar had not physically crossed the Rubicon with his army into Italy and captured Rome. Yet the only thing necessary to explain the rise of Christianity is a belief. a belief that the resurrection happened. There is nothing that an actual resurrection would have caused that could not have been caused by a mere belief in that resurrection. Thus, an actual resurrection is not necessary to explain all subsequent history. Unlike Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon, Carrier concludes that while we have many reasons to believe that Caesar crossed the Rubicon, all of them are lacking in the case of the resurrection. In fact, when we compare all 5 points, we see that in 4 of the 5 points of an event's historicity, the resurrection has no evidence at all. And in the one proof that it does have, it has not the best, but the very worst kind of evidence. A handful of biased, uncritical, unscholarly, unknown, second-hand witnesses. Indeed, you really have to look hard to find another event that is in a worse condition than this as far as evidence goes. So, even before we begin to examine Jesus' resurrection, we are forced to recognize that the historical evidence for it and all the other extraordinary events of Jesus' career is not only far from ironclad, but already suspect. There is nothing unreasonable about taking a skeptical approach to the Gospel's image of Jesus in the first place. And it is important to note that we are not just talking about the divine man-God Jesus coming under fire, because it is not just the supernatural aspect of Jesus that have come under suspicion. Even the mundane and perfectly plausible sounding aspect of Jesus' life have proved to be problematic, as we'll see with our next myth. For further reading, Charles Talbot, What is a Gospel? Richard Carrier, Sense and Goodness Without God. Robert Price, Jesus, Myth and Method in The Christian Delusion. I think that's maybe that's in a book, The Christian Delusion, and that's a piece of that book. No, most historians no longer use the terms BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, to label years. Instead, they, and this book, except when quoting from other sources, use BCE, before Common Era, and CE, Common Era. So that's the end of chapter 1 and myth number 1. And yes, there's a very good reason to be skeptical about the idea that a Jesus existed at all. So there you go.
I am absolutely convinced that the main source of hatred in the world is religion. And I think it should be religion treated with ridicule and hatred and contempt.
Share the same way.